I never thought suburban life would feel like a battlefield. After years of grinding through Silicon Valley chaos, I bought a quiet home in Cedar Ridge Enclave, dreaming of peace, maybe some BBQ nights, lazy Sundays, and a garden full of ridiculous gnomes. But peace didn't last long. Enter HOA Karen, her real name Beatrice Cranston, the self-proclaimed queen of clipboards. She fined me for my mailbox shade, threatened me over holiday lights, and even declared war on my lawn gnome like it was a national security risk. At first, I tried to play along, thinking compliance might calm the storm. But Karen didn't want peace, she wanted control. And that's when I realized if she wanted to play tyrant, I'd have to outmaneuver her with something far more powerful than a neatly trimmed lawn. What began as petty fines soon spiraled into a plan so audacious it would flip the entire neighborhood upside down. Before we dive in, let me ask you this. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to see just how far this story of HOA madness can travel. When I first set foot in Cedar Ridge Enclave, the place looked like something straight out of a glossy suburban real estate brochure. Perfectly paved streets curved around manicured cul-de-sacs. Rows of cookie-cutter houses with beige siding and identical shutters stood in stiff formation like soldiers in some strange architectural army. The lawns looked so uniform I half expected to find laser lines cut into the grass, each blade standing at military attention. I had just walked away from years of sleepless nights at my startup, endless investor meetings, coding marathons, and the kind of stress that chews you up from the inside. When a big tech conglomerate bought us out, I finally had the money to breathe. And more importantly, I had the freedom to choose where and how I lived. I wasn't chasing yachts, Ferraris, or penthouses. No, what I wanted was something embarrassingly simple: peace. A backyard, a grill, maybe a vegetable garden. Just silence after years of chaos. The real estate agent had practically sung the praises of Cedar Ridge. Quiet community, family-friendly HOA, keeps everything tidy and consistent, she chirped, smiling, as if that were the best selling point in the world. I should have paid more attention to that last part, the HOA. But exhausted, desperate for a change, I ignored the red flags. I signed the papers and moved in, thinking I had finally stumbled into the good life. The very first day I found the welcome package waiting on my doorstep, a wicker basket of muffins, some coupons for the local hardware store, and a binder so thick it could double as a murder weapon, labeled Cedar Ridge Enclave Homeowners Association Guidelines. I chuckled, setting it aside. Rules about trash bins and paint colors didn't concern me. At least not then. 2 days later, the first crack in the facade appeared. A crisp white envelope slid under my front door. Inside, a formal letter typed neatly warning me that unauthorized lawn ornaments were prohibited. The culprit, my cheerful little garden gnome, a goofy red-hatted fellow I'd nicknamed Ralph. Apparently Ralph didn't meet the aesthetic standards of Cedar Ridge. The letter was signed by none other than Beatrice K. Cranston, HOA president. Her name alone radiated menace like a villain, straight out of an English boarding school novel. And sure enough, when I first met her in person, she lived up to the reputation. She showed up one morning, clipboard in hand posture, rigid, as if she'd swallowed a broomstick. Her hair was sculpted into a stiff helmet of blonde curls, and her expression was the kind that could curdle milk. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone clipped and nasal, "I see you've already received your notice." I nodded, half amused, half irritated. "It's just a garden gnome." "It is not just a garden gnome," she snapped. "It is a violation. This neighborhood maintains certain standards. Cedar Ridge Enclave is not whimsical." That was my first real taste of Beatrice Cranston, the tyrant queen of suburban order, and she didn't stop at Ralph. Within a week I received 3 more violations. Notices my mailbox was apparently the wrong shade of forest green. Who knew forest green had 40 shades? My lawn was an inch taller than their maximum allowance, and my basketball hoop hadn't been stored within the prescribed 24-hour period after use. It would have been funny if it weren't so relentless. Each notice came with a fine, small at first, then escalating. $25 here, $50 there. Petty tyranny disguised as neighborhood standards. Neighbors whispered about her too. I started chatting with a retired couple across the street, the Millers, who'd lived there for 20 years. They rolled their eyes whenever Beatrice's name came up. "She fined us for leaving our trash can on the curb for 30 minutes too long," Mrs. Miller confided. 30 minutes. Another neighbor, a single mom named Erica, told me how Beatrice once threatened to have her daughter's lemonade stand shut down because it blocked pedestrian pathways. It was clear this wasn't about community, it was about control. And Beatrice Cranston thrived on control. At first, I tried to be the reasonable one. I trimmed the lawn exactly to the approved length, replaced my mailbox with the correct green, and even moved Ralph my gnome into the backyard where only I could see him. But it wasn't enough. With Beatrice, it was never enough. One afternoon I came home from a grocery run to find her standing in my driveway snapping photos of my car with her phone. I asked her what she thought she was doing, and she replied with icy calm, documenting another violation. Vehicles may not remain parked in the driveway for more than 24 consecutive hours. Your car was here yesterday morning. That is unacceptable. I laughed out loud. It's my driveway, my car, my property. Her lips pursed into a thin line. Not when you live under HOA jurisdiction. The rules apply to everyone. Something in her tone, smug, absolute dripping, with the certainty of her petty empire, ignited a spark in me. That was the moment the seed of rebellion planted itself. I hadn't clawed my way through the brutal world of startups negotiated with venture capital sharks and survived corporate buyouts, just to be bullied by a suburban despot with a clipboard. But for a while I played along. I went to the HOA meetings she presided over like a queen on a throne. They were held in the community center, a beige, soulless little room with fluorescent lighting that buzzed like a swarm of angry bees. Beatrice sat at the head of a long table flanked by her loyal board members, a collection of sycophants who nodded at everything she said. She would drone on about property values, uniformity, and preserving the integrity of Cedar Ridge. During one meeting, she called me out publicly for my holiday lights. I had hung a single string of multicolored bulbs along my porch. To me, it was cheerful. To her, it was distracting and disruptive to neighborhood harmony. She made me remove them. I left that meeting fuming, but beneath the anger, something else was stirring. I wasn't just annoyed anymore, I was determined. If she wanted to play dictator, I would find a way to play emperor. What Beatrice didn't know was that I had a habit of digging. In my old life, when negotiating with corporations and investors, I learned that every fortress has a weak point. Every system has a loophole. And the HOA, despite its posturing and paperwork, was no different. I began collecting documents. Every bylaw, every amendment, every line of HOA fine print. I filed public records requests with the county clerk's office pulling deeds and development agreements for Cedar Ridge. What I discovered sent a surge of adrenaline racing through me. The HOA wasn't the ultimate authority here. The true power still rested with Ridgefield Development LLC, the original developer of Cedar Ridge Enclave. And thanks to state statutes on common interest communities, Ridgefield still retained what's known as special declarant rights, the ability to amend governing documents, appoint or remove the HOA board, and even dissolve the HOA if they chose. It was the golden ticket, the weak point in Beatrice's carefully constructed empire. If I could acquire Ridgefield Development LLC, I wouldn't just be another homeowner at her mercy. I would be the homeowner, the one with the legal right to dismantle the HOA brick by brick. That realization changed everything. No more reacting to fines, no more pleading my case at her kangaroo court meetings. I wasn't going to fight her on her turf. I was going to flip the board entirely. From that day on, every smug smile, every passive-aggressive letter, every absurd rule she tried to enforce only fueled me further. She thought she was playing a game of fines and notices. But I was already planning a hostile takeover that would end her reign for good. The Suburban War had officially begun. I became a student of jargon. Where most people saw dry legal paperwork, I began to see strategy clauses that could be levered, dates that mattered, signatures that opened doors. My evenings filled with reading CC&R's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, recorded plats, and the faintly smelling cardboard of old file folders at the county recorder's office. The county clerk's basement smelled like dust and victory. An elderly clerk with bifocals and an affection for stamping things helped me pull deeds and assignments that to him were just another Tuesday. To me, they were breadcrumbs. The key phrase, the one that made my heart skip, was special declarant rights. Ridgefield Development LLC, the faceless company that had poured the concrete and set the mailboxes, hadn't fully relinquished the sort of control developers keep until they finish selling. In the fine print tucked under amendments and obscurely titled exhibits was the developer's retained authority to approve architectural guidelines, appoint initial board members, and exercise certain vetoes. In short, the HOA, as petty as it was a creature of Ridgefield. Strip away the shadow of the developer, and the HOA's roar would be a whimper. I called Nora Patel that night. Nora was not the kind of lawyer who dressed like a character in a courtroom drama, no pinstripe suits, no theatrics. She had a reputation for being surgical, precise, and oddly warm for someone who spent most of her life in contract clauses. When I told her about Ridgefield's retained rights, there was a long silence on the line, then a laugh, half disbelief, half appreciation. If what you found is true, Liam, you're not just mad, you're in possession of a legal opening broader than most people ever get. Nora told me what I needed to know in plain terms. There were two paths. The expensive conventional route challenge the HOA in litigation, drag everyone into months of ugly court filings and probable appeals, or the audacious route where litigation was a last resort and acquisition was the scalpel. Buy the developer and the authority to rework the HOA's governing structure transfers with the land. You change the master, you change the rules, Nora said. But acquiring a development company isn't a charity case. There are liens, indemnities, environmental inspections, developer warranties, and maybe construction defects. You have to know what you're buying. Finance was the next mountain. I called Diego Morales, my old CFO from the startup era, sharp, quick, and allergic to waste. Diego loved puzzles and spreadsheets the way some people love rock climbing. When I explained the idea, he grinned. We don't buy a subdivision like we buy a watch on eBay, he said. But with the right structure, mezzanine debt seller financing and escrow arrangement, we can make an offer that looks attractive to them and bearable to us. We found out Ridgefield wasn't some monolithic giant. It was an arm of a regional development portfolio that had shifted focus after a downturn. That meant Motive's developers aren't sentimental about nostalgic porches. They are transactional. If their balance sheet showed overhead, if there were ongoing maintenance obligations, if carrying the property had become a pain point, my cash offer could be a welcome relief. The devil, Nora reminded me, was always in due diligence. Due diligence became my daily ritual. Nora and I drafted lists longer than a Thanksgiving grocery run. Title searches, environmental assessments, pending litigation warranties to lot buyers, construction defect claims, outstanding utility easements, insurance claims, tax liabilities. Each box I ticked shaped the price and the bargaining. Posture. I spent afternoons on the phone with municipal planning departments asking about infrastructure commitments Ridgefield had made years ago, stormwater retention, road improvements, a promise of green space. Those commitments mattered because they translated to future expenses. If Ridgefield had left a tangle of unfulfilled obligations, the price for buying them would fall. Then there was psychology. Everything about Cedar Ridge screamed conformity. The residents had been trained to obey. That meant I couldn't go in loud and flashy. I needed to be a ghost behind the curtain until the final reveal. I kept paying my fines. I went to every HOA meeting, sat in the back, let Beatrice finish her monologues. She loved the ritual, the rustle of violation notices, the approving nods from her little court. She never suspected the man who grumbled about mailbox shades at her table was the one who'd been scanning deeds in a dirt-scented office. Negotiation, when it started, felt strangely like a merger I'd handled in my old life. Ridgefield's owners weren't malevolent. They were pragmatic. Their investment group was busy rebalancing. They had spreadsheets that wanted a clean exit. Nora's first drafts were surgical, an LOI that hinted at speed and certainty, an offer large enough to be respectful with contingencies for title and environmental clearances. The real magic was the human element, speaking to the operations manager, who'd overseen Cedar Ridge for years, listening to their complaints about aging infrastructure and offering a transition plan that would save face. No one wants to be the developer who left a mess. They wanted to hand that mess to someone who'd take it off their books. There were nights when I woke up thinking of clauses, representations, and warranties that would keep me honest, indemnities that would keep surprises rare. Diego and I mapped financing scenarios until our eyes blurred. What if the development had an outstanding lien? What if a stormwater retention pond required immediate dredging? Every what if reduced the offer by some percentage. But some things couldn't be reduced. The opportunity cost of a life spent under Beatrice's thumb, the value of mental peace, the communal good I'd envisioned for Cedar Ridge. We built those intangible returns into our model. When the deal sheet finally crossed my desk, I felt a mix of elation and danger. The price was painful enough to hurt a little and confident enough to seal the seller's nod. We used a standard escrow mechanism with a clear timeline for diligence. There were deposit tranches, holdbacks for identified liabilities, and a robust set of closing conditions. The seller wanted a fast close. I wanted a clean one. Nora negotiated hard on indemnities if there were any unknown contamination issues or undisclosed structural defects. Ridgefield's side would be on the hook. I didn't want to inherit an environmental nightmare. Throughout all of this, I kept my social face steady. At HOA meetings, I tolerated Beatrice's performative outrage. When she waved another violation at me, I smiled and said, "Noted." Inside, I was arranging closings and escrow instructions. I'd attend neighborhood potlucks all the while, imagining what I'd change when the papers recorded and the county clerk's stamps made it official. But the world never cooperates with neat timelines. An unexpected twist emerged during due diligence. An old holder of a small parcel had never signed a quitclaim regarding a narrow access easement. It was the sort of clerical quirk that could stall a closing or give a litigious neighbor a foothold. Nora and I drafted remedies, a title cure, a modest payment, a covenant to quiet title if needed. Ridgefield's legal counsel sniffed at this and asked for a brief hold to consult their managers. Every pause nudged the possibility of discovery. If Beatrice or any board member smelled something, they might accelerate their own maneuvers. So we kept the whole thing under wraps. The purchase agreement stipulated confidentiality. Only Nora Diego, our escrow officer, and a few necessary bankers knew. It felt like planning a heist in broad daylight, a polite legal heist where the loot would be a community freed from petty governance. And all the while Beatrice sharpened her tongue. She couldn't know what battle was forming in the back offices of county government, but she could sense change. Her meetings grew more strident, her memos multiplied. She called for special votes, circulated new, even stricter interpretations of yard codes, as if reinforcing the rulebook would armor her against the unknown. What she didn't understand was that rules are brittle when they are enforced by fear alone. Remove the fear and the rules are just paper. By the time the escrow period neared its end, I felt like a strange hybrid equal parts ex-entrepreneur, community organizer, and legal hobbyist. The house I'd bought for peace was becoming a fulcrum. I couldn't help it, this had become personal. Not revenge for the sake of spite, but revenge that felt righteous, reclaiming my quiet life by dismantling a regime that had claimed the right to legislate joy. The final documents were ready. Ridgefield sellers signed. The escrow officer stamped the papers, and quietly, no fanfare, no dramatic music, Ridgefield Development LLC's ownership interest in Cedar Ridge changed hands. For the first time, an actual legal instrument sat in the county's record, proving what I'd dreamed, that ownership can be a tool for liberation. I remember the moment I looked at Nora and Diego after the closing call and felt a weight lift. I had spent millions on bad coffee during negotiations, on late-night calls, on due diligence reports that read like thick novels. But sitting there with the ink dried and the county records updated, I felt the future tilt in a way that made my chest warm. Beatrice still prowled her meetings clipboard like a scepter. But now, somewhere in a drawer with my name on it, I held the authority to rewrite the rules. The Suburban War, which had started with a ridiculous garden gnome, was about to enter its next act. I wasn't done yet. I had the papers and the power. But power unexercised is potential wasted. The next move required timing theater and a little mercy, because tearing down a petty kingdom isn't as satisfying if you break the town in the process. And so I waited for the right meeting, the right moment, the right expression on Beatrice's face when the papers went on display and the room realized that the rules were about to change. I had the power in my hands, but power is only useful when applied at the right moment. In business, I'd learned that timing could make or break entire ventures. Launch too early and you burn cash, launch too late and someone else takes the market. Now, in the strange theater of suburban politics, timing would determine whether my plan looked like an outrageous stunt or a legitimate transfer of authority. I wasn't about to waste it on a casual Tuesday. Instead, I staged my silence like a ritual. I kept mowing the lawn to regulation height, a choreographed compliance that made Beatrice gloat as if she'd tamed me. I kept paying her absurd fines, the mailbox green that was off by 2 shades, the basketball hoop left in the driveway for 30 hours instead of 24. Each payment was like a poker player calling a bet, hiding the winning hand just a little longer. Behind the curtain, though, things moved fast. Nora prepared binders, not the glossy kind HOAs love, but thick legal binders filled with amendments, assignments, and the recorded documents showing Ridgefield's sale. She highlighted the clauses that transferred special declarant rights directly into my name. Diego, for his part, built a financial timeline, showing how the HOA's current fine-based system was not only petty, but fiscally absurd. He compared it to a failing subscription business model that relied on punishment instead of actual revenue. His spreadsheets became ammunition for the town hall battle I was planning. Meanwhile, I began to walk the neighborhood with purpose. Suburban warfare is not only won in conference rooms, it's won in driveways and over cups of coffee. I stopped by the miller's porch and asked them what they'd change if the HOA weren't breathing down their necks. Their answer was simple. They wanted to repaint their shutters something other than beige. Erica, the single mom, said she wanted to plant sunflowers taller than her fence without getting fined. A teenager named Josh, whose skateboard had been confiscated during an HOA patrol, told me he just wanted a basketball hoop left standing so kids could play without fear. These weren't radical demands. They were modest human desires, the kind of desires Beatrice's regime had crushed under the weight of community standards. And the more I listened, the more I realized I wasn't staging a coup for myself alone. I was staging it for every neighbor who had swallowed resentment and stayed silent. Still, the HOA meetings dragged on. Beatrice had a way of stretching 1 hour into 3, her voice like nails on a chalkboard as she recited violations and new proposed amendments. She stood at the head of the table like a school principal, scolding disobedient children. Her clipboard never left her hand. If she could have engraved the HOA bylaws on stone tablets and descended a mountain, she would have. It was during one of those meetings that she unveiled her masterpiece of tyranny, a new regulation requiring all holiday decorations to be pre-approved by the board. "We cannot have chaos," she declared, with clashing lights, inflatable Santas, or tacky themes. She spat out the word tacky like it was profanity. I sat in the back, my folder of legal documents resting against my knee, and smiled. She thought she was tightening her grip, but all she was doing was building the stage higher for my reveal. The date I chose was deliberate, the annual spring HOA gathering when the largest number of residents turned up. Beatrice loved this event. It was her crown jewel, the day she paraded through PowerPoint slides about property values and the neighborhood's integrity. She always ended with a slideshow of violations corrected, complete with before and after photos of residents shamed into submission. On the morning of that meeting, I slipped my documents into a sleek black leather binder. Not the kind that looked like rebellion, just professional, controlled lethal in its quiet authority. I practiced my speech once in front of the mirror. It wasn't dramatic, it was precise. A coup dressed as a shareholder update. But as fate would have it, the universe decided to test me. The night before the meeting, Beatrice appeared at my door with 2 board members in tow. She waved a violation notice like a flag. My crime this time: a temporary inflatable hot tub I'd set up in the backyard for a barbecue with friends. She accused me of visual pollution and threatened me with a $500 fine. Her timing was exquisite. I signed the violation slip with a straight face, thanked her, and watched her march down the driveway. If she had looked back, she would have seen me laughing. She had no idea she'd just set the stage perfectly for me. The next evening, the community center buzzed with chatter. Residents shuffled in carrying folding chairs, styrofoam cups of coffee, and the kind of resigned expressions that come from years of mandatory attendance. Beatrice stood at the podium beaming as if she were hosting an awards show. Her board flanked her like backup singers. She launched into her usual litany. "This year we've maintained property values, ensured compliance, and upheld the proud aesthetic of Cedar Ridge Enclave." The room hummed with polite boredom. When she reached the slide about my inflatable hot tub, her eyes gleamed with malice. "Certain residents believe the rules do not apply to them," she said, staring directly at me. "But the HOA is committed to fairness. No one is above our standards." That was my cue. I rose from my seat, binder in hand. "Actually, Beatrice," I said, my voice calm, but carrying across the room, "there's been a development everyone here deserves to know about." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Beatrice scowled. "Mr. Carter, this is not the time." "It is," I interrupted, "because as of last week, Cedar Ridge Enclave has a new owner. Ridgefield Development LLC sold its interest, and the special declarant rights now belong to me." The silence that followed was almost physical, pressing down on the room like a held breath. Then whispers exploded. Faces turned. The Millers gasped. Erica covered her mouth with her hand. Josh whispered no way to his friends. Beatrice's face drained of color. Her clipboard trembled in her hands. You can't just..." I opened my binder and held up the recorded deed assignment stamped by the county clerk. "I can, and I did. It's public record." For the first time in years, her words faltered. She sputtered, papers sliding from her hands. One of her board members bent to pick them up, but stopped when he saw the crowd's reaction, half awe, half glee. The tyrant had been unmasked, and the emperor's clothes were gone. I didn't gloat, I didn't shout. I simply laid out the facts. The HOA's authority was subordinate to mine, as the holder of developer rights. I explained how I intended to restructure the HOA, forgive all fines, and shift from punishment to community celebration. I told them the first order of business was dissolving the most ridiculous rules: mailbox shades, holiday decoration limits, garden gnome bans. Applause began hesitantly, then grew until the entire room was clapping. Some residents even stood. For the first time since I'd moved in, the atmosphere wasn't one of fear, it was of relief. Beatrice sank into her chair, pale and shaking. She muttered something about legal challenges, but even her loyal board members no longer looked convinced. They saw what she hadn't: her era was over. The war wasn't finished yet. I knew she would fight back with every tool she could muster. But for that moment, the tide had turned. I wasn't just the guy with the wrong mailbox shade anymore. I was the man who had bought the keys to the kingdom. And for the first time, Cedar Ridge Enclave belonged to its people, not its petty queen. The silence after my announcement lingered like the pause before a storm. Beatrice sat rigid, her knuckles white against the clipboard, as if gripping it tightly enough could stop her power from slipping away. Her board members, those once loyal lieutenants, suddenly looked like children caught cheating on a test. The crowd, though, buzzed with an energy I hadn't felt since I moved into Cedar Ridge, something like hope mixed with disbelief. I had expected resistance, and Beatrice didn't disappoint. She stood her chair screeching against the floor and jabbed her pen toward me like a weapon. "This is outrageous," she screeched. "You can't just waltz in here and claim ownership over our community. This is a scam." Her voice cracked, but her words carried weight. A few people frowned uncertainty, tugging at their relief. So I let her speak. I knew Nora had warned me never interrupt an opponent when they're unraveling. Beatrice ranted about integrity and the sanctity of the HOA, waving her clipboard as though it were the U.S. Constitution. She threatened to call county officials to bring in lawyers, even muttered about injunctions. Finally, when her tirade hit a fever pitch, I opened the binder again and pulled out the pièce de résistance certified recorded documents from the county recorder's office. Each stamped page bore the weight of law, not rhetoric. "Check the seal," I said calmly, handing it to a neighbor in the front row. "It's not my word against hers, it's the county's record. Ridgefield Development LLC transferred its special declarant rights to me. I'm not here to break the rules. I'm here to rewrite them." The neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a man Beatrice once fined for planting tulips too close to his sidewalk, studied the page with his glasses halfway down his nose. He nodded slowly, then turned to the room. "It's real." His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough. Murmurs turned into agreement. Heads began to nod. The momentum shifted, and Beatrice knew it. Still, she wasn't done. "I'll sue you," she spat. "I'll sue Ridgefield. I'll sue this entire neighborhood if I have to." Her desperation was almost theatrical, and I had to bite back a grin. "You're welcome to try," I replied. "But the contract is airtight, the county has recorded it, and Ridgefield is thrilled to wash its hands of Cedar Ridge. You might file a lawsuit, but the law is clear: you no longer have the authority you think you do." Her clipboard clattered onto the table, the sound echoing through the room like a gavel ending a trial. That was the moment I struck. I laid out the Manifesto of Freedom Nora, and I had crafted a new set of community principles to replace Beatrice's suffocating bylaws. "All outstanding fines," I began, "are forgiven. Starting tonight, consider this a clean slate." Gasps and cheers erupted. Mrs. Miller actually clapped, tears glistening in her eyes. "Second, I continued the bans on holiday lights, yard ornaments, and mailbox shades are abolished. You can paint your shutters purple if you want, and your gnomes are welcome here." Laughter swept the room, relief mixing with joy. Someone even shouted, "Bring back Ralph the Gnome." And finally, I said, my voice steady, "Cedar Ridge will no longer be governed by fear of fines. From today forward, this is a community built on cooperation, not punishment. The HOA will exist only as a community association, a group for events, improvements, and keeping us connected, not as a weapon." The cheers grew louder, echoing off the beige walls of the community center. For once, those walls felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Beatrice, though, slumped into her chair. Her reign wasn't completely over. She still had influence, allies, and her own taste for drama. I knew she'd regroup. Tyrants rarely vanish quietly. But her grip had been shattered in public, and once neighbors tasted freedom, they wouldn't go back. The days that followed were a blur of legal paperwork and neighborhood conversations. Nora guided me through the formal process of dissolving the old board. Each step was meticulously documented, special meetings called minutes, recorded votes tallied. It wasn't enough to have power. I had to wield it transparently, or Beatrice would seize on any technicality. Diego, meanwhile, created a financial plan to stabilize the association. Without fines, we needed to restructure the HOA budget. We found savings in absurd places. Beatrice had spent thousands annually on compliance patrols and hired inspectors to measure grass height with rulers. That nonsense was cut immediately. Instead, we reallocated funds to a community events budget. BBQ nights, kids' movie screenings, a neighborhood garden project. Neighbors began approaching me in the street, no longer with hushed complaints, but with smiles. "I can finally repaint my door," one said. "We're going to host a block party," another added. Even kids seemed freer, riding bikes and shooting hoops without looking over their shoulders. But freedom never sits well with tyrants. Beatrice launched her counterattack in the only way she knew, through the courts. She filed for a temporary restraining order claiming my acquisition was fraudulent. Nora was ready. She drafted a devastating response citing statutory provisions, contract law, and case precedents from other HOA takeovers. Within 2 weeks, a judge denied Beatrice's request, calling her claims unsupported and speculative. That legal defeat should have ended it, but Beatrice didn't retreat. Instead, she doubled down in her way, fear-mongering. Flyers appeared in mailboxes warning that my power grab would collapse property values. She whispered that I was bankrupting the community for my own ego. Some neighbors wavered, their decades of HOA conditioning hard to shake. So I hosted a town hall. Not in the sterile community center Beatrice loved, but outside in the Miller's wide driveway under string lights and with a grill sizzling in the background. I stood with no binder, no legalese, just truth. Look around you, I told them. Do you feel freer today than you did a month ago? Has your life improved since we cut the leash of fines? And has anyone here seen property values drop, or have they climbed because Cedar Ridge is finally a place people want to live? Heads nodded. People smiled. Erica held up her phone, showing a realtor's listing that boasted no oppressive HOA rules, true community living. The price tag was higher than any sale in the neighborhood last year. Proof right there on Zillow that liberation could be profitable. That night sealed the shift. Even those who had hesitated came around. And Beatrice, once feared, now looked more like a caricature, muttering threats that nobody took seriously. Still, I didn't underestimate her. Every revolution has its final gasp of resistance. I knew hers was coming, but this time I wasn't the lone newcomer being harassed over a gnome. I had the neighborhood behind me, and more importantly, the law on my side. When I walked home that night, string lights glowing behind me and the laughter of neighbors ringing in the air, I felt something I hadn't felt since before I ever moved to Cedar Ridge: peace. Real hard-won peace. And yet deep down I knew this was only the intermission. Beatrice wasn't finished. She was too proud, too invested, too hungry for control. She would strike again. The question wasn't if, but when. For the first time, though, I wasn't afraid of her. I was ready. The storm broke 2 weeks later, and it came exactly as I'd predicted, not in the form of lawn inspections or violation notices, but with lawyers. Beatrice Cranston had decided that if she couldn't control Cedar Ridge by clipboard, she'd try to reclaim it through the courts. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside a certified mail envelope. She'd filed a complaint in county civil court, accusing me of fraud, self-dealing, and hostile seizure of community governance. The legal jargon was designed to sound terrifying, as though I'd staged a coup d'etat instead of a clean recorded acquisition. She demanded damages, the reinstatement of her board, and naturally attorney's fees. I called Nora immediately. She skimmed the complaint in silence, then chuckled. She thinks volume equals strength. Half these claims are recycled from HOA forums. The other half are baseless. Can she do anything with it? I asked. Anyone can file a complaint, Nora replied. But a judge isn't going to resurrect a dethroned HOA president just because she's screaming. Still, we'll treat this like chess. File a response counter with facts and position you as the reasonable adult in the room. So we went to war on paper. Nora drafted a crisp, lethal response motions to dismiss exhibits of the recorded transfer affidavits from Ridgefield's executives confirming the sale. Diego contributed financial data showing how the HOA had bled residents with fines under Beatrice's regime, contrasting it with our transparent budgets. We painted her not as a leader, but as a petty tyrant clinging to scraps of power. While lawyers parried, I shored up the neighborhood's morale. Beatrice's flyers had returned dramatic black and white sheets warning that property values will collapse under Carter's anarchist rule. She claimed that without her enforcement, Cedar Ridge would devolve into a wasteland of rusting cars, peeling paint, and inflatable Santas in June. Instead of counterflyers, I chose visibility. We hosted a Saturday block party right on the Greenbelt, a place she once forbade gatherings because it damaged the sod. Families brought grills, kids set up lemonade stands, and a local band played covers until the stars came out. I circulated with a plate of ribs in one hand, shaking hands with neighbors and listening to what they wanted. A community garden done. A basketball court in the cul-de-sac, we'd get quotes. The next morning I checked Zillow. A 3-bedroom house in Cedar Ridge had just gone under contract for 15% above last year's average. Property values weren't collapsing, they were rising. And not because of manicured lawns, but because joy had returned. Beatrice, of course, refused to see it. Her lawsuit limped forward, but Nora dismantled it, hearing by hearing. The judge eventually denied her request for a preliminary injunction, noting she had failed to demonstrate likelihood of success. That phrase might as well have been a guillotine. Without the injunction, she had no immediate leverage. Cornered Beatrice doubled down in her own way. She staged an emergency meeting in her driveway, gathering her dwindling circle of loyalists. I watched from across the street as she waved documents in the air, her voice shrill even from a distance. Some neighbors listened politely, most rolled their eyes. For every supporter she kept, she lost two more. Her last gambit came in the form of a smear campaign. She whispered that I'd bankrupt the association, that my startup fortune had evaporated, that the neighborhood would collapse under my dictatorial whims. Irony dripped from her words, the dictator accusing me of dictatorship. I didn't bite. Instead, I called another town hall. This time in the community center she once ruled like a throne room. The atmosphere was completely different. String lights hung from the ceiling, tables were loaded with potluck dishes, and laughter filled the air before the meeting even began. I stood at the front, not at the head table but among the people, and opened with a simple statement: I'm not here to lecture you, I'm here to listen. For the next hour we brainstormed. Residents suggested ideas for events, improvements, even silly contests like best lawn flamingo display. We voted informally right there, the laughter loud enough to echo down the hallway. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Beatrice had used meetings to dictate. We used them to dream. That night, as I walked home under the glow of porch lights and the sound of kids still playing outside, I realized something. Beatrice wasn't just losing her grip. She was irrelevant. A clipboard can't compete with joy. But I also knew people like her rarely go quietly. And sure enough, her final act was as dramatic as I'd expected. One morning, moving trucks arrived at her house. She stood on the driveway, arms crossed, watching as movers carried out boxes labeled HOA, files, and archives. Her face was carved with bitterness, but also resignation. She didn't wave, didn't speak, didn't even glance at the neighbors who peeked from their windows. By sundown, she was gone. Just like that, the woman who had policed mailboxes and outlawed gnomes had vanished from Cedar Ridge. The neighborhood responded the only way it knew how now, with celebration. We organized an impromptu gathering, raising plastic cups of cheap champagne and toasts. The Millers suggested a tradition, an annual Independence Day of Cedar Ridge, to commemorate the end of Beatrice's reign. The idea stuck instantly, and so we planned the first one. A festival in the park, complete with food, trucks, live music, and a bonfire where we burned copies of old violation notices. Kids cheered as flames devoured the paper that once fined them for riding scooters on the sidewalk. Adults laughed as they tossed in their letters, mailbox infractions, lawn warnings, even Erica's infamous lemonade stand violation. That night, under the stars, I looked around at a community transformed. The fear was gone, replaced with warmth. Neighbors who barely spoke before were laughing together. Houses glowed with decorations no one feared would bring fines. It wasn't chaos. It was life. Yet I knew something else too. Cedar Ridge's transformation wasn't just about me. It was about people realizing they had a choice. That rules could protect or they could suffocate, and when they suffocate, you fight back, not with anger, but with something bigger. Still deep in my chest, there was a quiet satisfaction. I'd come here searching for peace, and instead I'd found war. But by fighting it on my terms, through patience, research, and one audacious move, I'd given the whole neighborhood the peace it deserved. The HOA war wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours. And Cedar Ridge was free. For a brief moment, life in Cedar Ridge felt almost normal. Kids chalked hopscotch squares onto sidewalks without fear of defacement notices. Holiday lights twinkled on porches in April, unapologetic and bright. Ralph the garden gnome stood proudly at the end of my walkway, a little chipped but triumphant. The tyranny of beige conformity seemed to have evaporated into the spring air. But Beatrice Cranston wasn't a woman wired for surrender. People like her never vanish completely. Sure, she'd moved out her driveway empty, the for sale sign eventually replaced with a cheerful sold. But as Nora warned me over coffee one morning, power-hungry people always search for a new outlet. Don't assume she's finished just because she's gone. Nora was right. The first sign of her counterstrike arrived in the form of a thick envelope delivered by courier. Inside was a letter not from Beatrice herself, but from a local law firm representing what they called the concerned citizens of Cedar Ridge. The letter accused me of misusing HOA funds, failing to follow proper meeting procedures, and ironically acting as a dictator. The demand stepped down and reinstate a traditional HOA board elected by her supporters. I laughed when I read it, but Nora didn't. She highlighted sections with her pen and tapped the page. It's flimsy but not harmless. She's trying to create the illusion of legitimacy by banding a handful of neighbors together. If she convinces enough people, even a weak claim can grow teeth. We weren't going to let her grow teeth. We responded within the week, filing a comprehensive rebuttal and attaching financial records Diego had carefully maintained. Every dollar collected had been accounted for. Every event we hosted, barbecues, movie nights, garden projects, was transparently budgeted. Our records stood in stark contrast to Beatrice's old system of arbitrary fines and discretionary spending. But paperwork wasn't enough. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore, it was psychological warfare. So I doubled down on what Beatrice never understood: community. We organized more events. The Spring Bloom Festival took over the cul-de-sac with flower stalls, homemade crafts, and a bake-off judged by the neighborhood kids. A retired veteran offered to build benches for the park, and we funded it with leftover money from our social fund. I even invited a local food truck to set up every Friday evening, turning a boring parking lot into a weekly hangout. The effect was immediate. People who once grumbled about HOA dues now saw them as investments in joy. They weren't paying to be policed, they were paying to celebrate. And the stronger the community grew, the weaker Beatrice's shadow became. Still, she wasn't finished. She filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board alleging that our community events violated local land use ordinances. She claimed our Friday food truck nights caused traffic hazards and that the festival's sound system violated noise restrictions. This time, I came prepared. I appeared at the zoning board meeting with a binder of permits, decibel measurements, and letters of support from nearly every resident. Parents brought kids to testify how much they loved the events. The Millers stood up and described how they'd seen more neighborly cooperation in 2 months than in 20 years under Beatrice's rule. Erica brought lemonade for the board members, which earned a smile even from the stern chairman. The complaint was dismissed unanimously. And the victory wasn't just legal, it was symbolic. Cedar Ridge had spoken loudly and proudly that it wanted freedom, not fear. But Beatrice still had one last card to play. Late one evening, Diego sent me a panicked text: "She's trying to bankrupt us." Attached was a scanned petition Beatrice's lawyer had filed in county court. It alleged we were mismanaging funds and demanded the appointment of a court-appointed receiver to take control of the HOA's finances. If granted, it would have stripped us of our authority overnight. It was a bold move, reckless even, but it was also dangerous. Judges sometimes appointed receivers just to avoid risk, and once in place, a receiver could undo everything we'd built. Nora moved fast. She drafted a brutal opposition brief, citing not only our transparent records, but also the explosive growth in property values since the HOA had been restructured. Realtors submitted affidavits showing how homes in Cedar Ridge were selling faster and higher than comparable properties in neighboring communities. Diego created charts proving that our events cost less than Beatrice's compliance patrols had. The hearing drew a crowd. Neighbors packed the courtroom, filling every bench and even lining the walls. Some held handmade signs: "No more clipboards, our community, our rules." It felt less like a court proceeding and more like a rally. Beatrice sat in the front row, arms crossed, her attorney whispering furiously in her ear. She looked smaller than I remembered, her confidence chipped away by each defeat. When the judge finally ruled, his words carried the weight of a gavel ending an era. The evidence shows clear, transparent financial management and broad community support. The petition for receivership is denied. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Even the bailiff cracked a smile before sternly ordering us to quiet down. Beatrice stormed out, her heels clattering against the floor like gunshots. That was the last time she ever tried to weaponize the law against Cedar Ridge. Afterward, we gathered in the park for an impromptu celebration. Neighbors brought coolers, guitars, and sparklers. Someone rigged up a projector and played a slideshow of our community events set to music. Kids chased fireflies while adults toasted with paper cups of beer. As I stood there watching families laugh and friends dance barefoot on the grass, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about defeating Beatrice or dismantling an HOA. It was about reclaiming what neighborhoods were supposed to be: places of belonging, not battlegrounds. Freedom hadn't brought chaos. It had brought color, sound, and life back to Cedar Ridge. Property values were soaring, but more importantly, so were spirits. And as fireworks lit the night sky, I knew we weren't just celebrating a legal victory. We were celebrating the rebirth of our community. Beatrice was gone. Her lawsuits had failed. Her clipboard was powerless. Cedar Ridge was free. But most of all, for the first time since moving here, I felt like I truly belonged, not as an outsider battling tyranny, but as a neighbor among neighbors, part of something greater than myself. And deep down, I knew the war was over, and we had won. The summer after Beatrice's final courtroom defeat felt like the first real summer Cedar Ridge had ever experienced. Instead of clipped hedges and patrolled driveways, The neighborhood pulsed with new energy, kids running barefoot, music drifting from porches, neighbors actually waving instead of glaring. It was almost surreal. I would sit on my front porch in the evenings watching Ralph the gnome preside proudly from the yard and think, this is how it should have been all along. But revolutions don't sustain themselves on good vibes alone. If Cedar Ridge was going to thrive long-term, we needed structure, not the kind that strangled creativity, but the kind that gave freedom a backbone. So I called another meeting this time not to fight but to build. We gathered at the park on a Saturday morning. No fluorescent lights, no podiums, no clipboards, just picnic blankets spread across the grass and a microphone plugged into a portable speaker. I opened with a simple statement: the HOA as you knew it is gone, but we still need a way to take care of shared spaces, host events, and handle budgets. The difference is, this time we do it together. The residents responded with enthusiasm. People began pitching ideas immediately. A young dad suggested creating a community improvement fund to upgrade the playground equipment. The Millers wanted a garden club with shared tools and a seed bank. Erica proposed a summer movie series projected onto the side of the community center. Even the teenagers chimed in, asking for a skate ramp and a basketball half-court. We decided to rebrand entirely. No more Cedar Ridge HOA. The very letters HOA carried too much baggage, too many scars. We renamed it the Cedar Ridge Community Club, a name that actually meant something human. We drafted a new charter built not on fines and punishments but on participation and contribution. Our first major act was to dismantle the old compliance committee. In its place, we created the Events and Fun Committee, a ragtag team tasked with organizing gatherings, competitions, and festivals. We set up subgroups for landscaping, maintenance, and safety, but all voluntary, all transparent. Instead of being forced, people signed up gladly because now they saw the results. I remember the first big event under this new system, the Cedar Ridge Gnome Festival. It started as a joke but quickly snowballed. Every family was invited to design a gnome painted, carved, dressed, whatever they liked. By the end of the week, over 100 gnomes decorated lawns, porches, and driveways. There were Viking gnomes, astronaut gnomes, even a gnome modeled after Beatrice holding a clipboard. That one won the most cathartic award. The festival drew visitors from outside the neighborhood too. Local news even sent a reporter who filmed a segment titled, "From Tyranny to Democracy, How a Community Rebuilt Itself." Watching that clip later, I laughed until tears ran down my cheeks. Financially, we thrived. Without compliance patrols draining the budget, we had surplus funds to reinvest. Diego helped set up a simple online dashboard where every resident could see where money went down to the dollar. Transparency turned suspicion into trust. And because the neighborhood had become fun, property values soared. Real estate agents began advertising Cedar Ridge as the community with no oppressive HOA. Houses sold above asking price, buyers eager to join what locals nicknamed the Freedom Subdivision. Of course, there were challenges. Freedom doesn't mean the absence of conflict. One neighbor painted his garage door neon orange and another strung Christmas lights in July that blinked lewder than life in neon colors. But instead of fines and threats, we laughed, talked it out, or voted. Sometimes compromise, sometimes celebration. We discovered that a community doesn't need uniformity to flourish, it needs conversation. Still, in quiet moments, I thought of Beatrice. Rumors trickled back she'd moved to another subdivision 2 towns over. Some said she tried to get on that HOA's board and was politely denied. Others claimed she'd begun lobbying for stricter zoning ordinances at the county level. She wasn't finished chasing control, she just wasn't our problem anymore. The contrast was stark. While she chased power, we built joy. The second annual Independence Day Festival proved it. We set up a bonfire in the park, roasted marshmallows, and burned effigies made from shredded violation notices donated by residents. Kids screamed with laughter as sparks flew. Adults raised cups and toasts to freedom. Halfway through, I stepped onto a makeshift stage and addressed everyone. A year ago, I said we were afraid of what color mailbox we had, of how long our grass grew, of whether a garden gnome would cost us $50. Tonight, look around. We're not afraid anymore. We're alive. The cheers were deafening. Afterward, as fireworks streaked the night sky, a new neighbor named Mike approached me. He'd just bought Beatrice's old house. So he said cautiously, "I hear there used to be an HOA here. Should I be worried?" I grinned. Not anymore. Here, the only thing you have to worry about is whether your gnome is funny enough to win first place. Mike laughed with relief. In that case, I'm all in. As I walked home that night, the sky still glowing faintly from fireworks, I realized Cedar Ridge had become something more than a neighborhood. It was proof, a living case study, that people could rewrite the rules when they refused to bow to petty tyrants. That freedom, when paired with respect and humor, could turn even the dullest suburb into a vibrant community. The HOA war had started with fines, threats, and humiliation. It ended with laughter, gnomes, and fireworks. And though Beatrice's shadow might linger somewhere out there here in Cedar Ridge, she was nothing more than a story parents told their kids at bonfires, a cautionary tale of what happens when one woman's obsession with control collides with an entire community's thirst for freedom. And in that sense, maybe she gave us a gift. Without her tyranny, we might never have discovered our strength. Without her clipboard, we might never have built our festival. Without her reign, we might never have declared our independence. Cedar Ridge was alive, and it was ours. By the time fall rolled around, Cedar Ridge had transformed so completely that visitors often couldn't believe it was once a battleground of fines and fear. The lawns no longer looked like carbon copies of each other. Some residents planted wildflowers instead of the HOA-approved turf, while others let their yards turn into tiny sanctuaries filled with bird feeders and quirky statues. Porch lights glowed in every imaginable color. The uniform beige monotony that Beatrice Cranston once worshipped had been replaced by a kaleidoscope of individuality, and somehow the neighborhood looked better than ever. But what struck me most wasn't the aesthetics, it was the spirit. I'd walk down the street and hear laughter spilling from driveways, smell barbecue smoke drifting from backyards, and see kids pedaling bicycles without glancing nervously for a clipboard patrol. Neighbors who had lived here for years but never truly connected were suddenly friends. People borrowed tools, traded recipes, and watched each other's kids. The culture of fear had evaporated, replaced by trust. It wasn't always smooth sailing. With freedom came experiments, and sometimes experiments got messy. One resident decided to turn his front yard into a miniature pumpkin patch in October. The vines spread across the sidewalk, and trick-or-treaters tripped over them during Halloween. Instead of fines, we held a light-hearted discussion at our next community gathering. The neighbor laughed, promised to rein in the vines, and suggested turning the idea into an official Cedar Ridge pumpkin contest next year. We all voted yes, and a new tradition was born. Another challenge came when a group of teenagers spray-painted a mural on the side of the community center. Under Beatrice, this would have been labeled graffiti and punished severely. Instead, we looked at the mural bright, colorful, depicting the neighborhood skyline, with Ralph the gnome standing tall in the middle, and decided it was art. We organized a weekend mural day, inviting kids and adults alike to add their own touches. What began as rebellion ended as collaboration, the wall now a patchwork of creativity that told our story. Even the finances which skeptics feared would collapse without fines thrived. Diego's transparent budgeting system worked like magic. Residents actually volunteered to contribute more when special projects came up. One month we crowdfunded enough to install new benches in the park. Another month we raised money for a neighborhood pizza night. Because people saw where their money went, and because it bought joy, instead of punishment, they gave freely. It wasn't long before Cedar Ridge became a minor local legend. Realtors marketed it as the neighborhood without fear. Families from nearby suburbs came to our festivals. The Gnome Festival drew hundreds, with entries so elaborate they looked like they belonged in an art gallery. A local brewery sponsored a beer tent, and food trucks lined the streets. What had started as defiance against pettiness had become a thriving cultural hub. But perhaps the most satisfying twist was Beatrice herself. Word spread that she had tried to replicate her old reign in another neighborhood, but the residents there caught wind of her Cedar Ridge history. They rejected her, immediately refusing to elect her to any board. She showed up at county hearings lobbying for stricter zoning codes, but her reputation preceded her. She was no longer a queen, just a cautionary tale. One evening, at our second annual Independence Day of Cedar Ridge, I stood before a bonfire with neighbors gathered around. We tossed more old violation notices into the flames. People had kept them as souvenirs, proof of how far we'd come. The papers curled, blackened, and vanished in sparks. Kids squealed with delight as the flames roared. Adults raised plastic cups and cheered. I looked around and felt a swell of pride. Not just because I had won, but because we had built something lasting. My original plan had been revenge buying Ridgefield Development to dismantle Beatrice's regime. But revenge had blossomed into something richer, a real community. When the fire died down, a new neighbor, Mike, the man who bought Beatrice's old house, approached me with a beer in hand. "You know," he said, "back when I was house hunting, I almost skipped Cedar Ridge because of its old HOA reviews online. They made this place sound like a nightmare. But now, this is the best move I ever made." I laughed. Funny how fast things can change. Not funny, he corrected. Incredible. You turned this place around. I thought about that on my walk home. The truth was, I hadn't done it alone. Yes, I'd lit the spark, but it was the neighbors who kept the fire alive, by showing up, by trusting each other, by daring to dream of something better than beige. That night, sitting on my porch with Ralph, the gnome keeping watch, I realized I had finally found what I'd been searching for when I left Silicon Valley peace. Not the peace of isolation, but the peace of belonging. Cedar Ridge was no longer just my home. It was proof that when people refuse to be bullied when they stand together, even the pettiest tyrant can be toppled. And sometimes out of that rebellion, something beautiful is born. If there's one thing Cedar Ridge taught me, it's this: rules are meant to guide, not to strangle. When power is abused, even the smallest regulation becomes a weapon. But when people reclaim their voice, when they choose community over conformity, the results can be extraordinary. We didn't just defeat an HOA president, we rediscovered what it meant to live together, to laugh together, to trust each other. Maybe you're facing your own Beatrice right now, someone who mistakes control for leadership, someone who thinks fear is the same as respect. If so, remember, you don't have to play their game. Sometimes the boldest move isn't to fight harder, but to change the rules entirely. So here's my challenge to you. Look at your own life, your own community. Where can you trade fear for freedom, uniformity for creativity, silence for laughter? And if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or any petty tyrant, share your story in the comments below. I promise this community will understand. Don't forget to subscribe because there are more stories where this came from, and trust me, you won't want to miss the next twist.